Have you ever noticed that the older we get, the quieter death becomes in conversation, yet the louder it becomes inside our hearts? At 20, we talk about dreams. At 30, we talk about goals. But somewhere after 40, in the stillness between our daily routines, something begins to stir. A question we rarely say aloud. A soft ache we carry through the day. What will happen when this chapter ends? How do I say goodbye to what I love most? And even more quietly, have I truly lived, or have I just been preparing to die? It's a strange paradox, isn't it? We spend the first half of life building, chasing, collecting, clinging. And just when we begin to understand what matters, time starts whispering that it won't wait. There's a line from Buddhist wisdom that feels like a bell ringing in the heart. The problem is, you think you have time, not in a cruel way, not as a threat, but as a call. A call to wake up, not just to the reality of death, but to the fullness of life. In the teachings of the Buddha, death is not an enemy. It is not a punishment. It is the most honest teacher we'll ever meet. And like all great teachers, it arrives not to frighten, but to awaken. Today I want to tell you a story. Not about dying, but about living. Not about fear, but about freedom. Because what if making peace with death wasn't about giving up on life, but about finally fully arriving in it? So take a breath with me. Let the world fall quiet for a moment and come close, because by the end of this journey, you may not fear death in the same way. You may begin to see it as the doorway through which all true love, all true presence begins. Her name was Anne. She was 51 when the first shadow fell across her life. On the outside, you might have called her lucky. Anne had a good job in marketing, a husband who loved her in his quiet, steady way, 2 grown children off at college, and a cozy home with a rose garden she tended every weekend. If you had asked her how she was doing, she would have smiled and said, "Good, busy, you know how life is." But life, as Anne had always known it, changed the night her mother called. It was late, almost midnight, and Anne was brushing her teeth when the phone rang. Her mother rarely called at that hour. Anne answered with a knot already forming in her stomach. "Anne, I think you need to come." Her father had collapsed in the kitchen. By the time Anne reached the hospital, he was already gone. Death did not knock at Anne's door with a warning. It burst in uninvited, tearing a hole through the fabric of her days. At the funeral, she moved like someone in a dream. People brought casseroles, hugged her too tightly, told her how strong she was. But inside, Anne was splitting open, not just with grief for her father, but with a sudden shattering awareness. Her parents were no longer a shield between her and the horizon. For the first time, death was not a distant figure at the edges of other people's lives. It was in the room, it was in the mirror. In the weeks that followed, Anne returned to work, smiled politely, met deadlines. But late at night, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the moonlit garden, feeling a strange hollowness beneath her ribs. She wondered if this was what middle age was supposed to feel like. Not a crisis, not a breakdown, just a quiet unraveling, like the seam of her life coming loose one thread at a time. One night, after the dishwasher had hummed its last cycle, and the house had gone still, Anne found herself scrolling on her phone, not for distraction, but for meaning. She stumbled onto a video titled, "How to Make Peace with Death, Buddhist Teachings on Life's End." Anne didn't know much about Buddhism. She thought of it as something monks practiced in faraway temples, but something about the title stopped her, a soft tug in her chest. She pressed play. The voice on the screen spoke gently, as if from across a quiet room. "Death is not the opposite of life. It is the mirror that shows us what matters most." Anne leaned back, letting the words wash over her. The speaker told a story of the Buddha sitting beneath a tree, watching the sun set, speaking to his disciples about impermanence, not as a threat, but as a reminder to love more fully, to release more lightly, to live as if every moment mattered. Tears sprang to Anne's eyes, sudden and sharp. She wasn't sure why. In the days that followed, she began to change small things. She walked slower through the garden, letting her fingers trail across the lavender and roses. She called her mother just to hear her voice. She paused at the window each evening, watching the sky shift from blue to gold to indigo, not as background noise, but as a kind of living painting. And yet the ache remained. Months passed. One morning, Anne found herself driving to a meditation group at a local Buddhist center. She almost turned back twice. She was sure she didn't belong. But when she walked through the doors, the smell of incense and the soft murmur of quiet voices drew her in. The teacher, an elderly woman named Mai, welcomed the group with a gentle smile. Her hair was silver, her face lined with years of laughter and loss. "Welcome," Mai said. "Today we practice sitting with impermanence." As the group settled onto cushions, Mai spoke. "Impermanence is not an idea," she said softly. "It is the truth of every breath, every heartbeat, every falling leaf. When we resist it, we suffer. When we open to it, we begin to taste freedom." Anne sat still, feeling her breath move in and out. She thought of her father's hands, rough and warm. She thought of her children's laughter, of the way her husband's eyes crinkled when he smiled, of her own face in the mirror, lined with the map of her years. She felt, for the first time, the simple reality of it all. Nothing would last. And somehow, that was what made it all so achingly beautiful. Over the weeks, Anne kept returning to the group. She learned to sit with discomfort, to notice her grief not as an enemy, but as a companion. She learned to place her hand on her chest when the ache rose, whispering to herself, "This too is part of love." She began to read Buddhist stories. The tale of Kisa Gotami, a mother who lost her child and sought the Buddha, who asked her to bring a mustard seed from a house untouched by death. She went from house to house, but found none. Through her journey, she understood. Death touches all. And in that truth, she found a strange, fierce peace. Anne began to speak differently with those around her. When her friends grumbled about aging, she smiled gently and said, "Each wrinkle, each gray hair, it means we're still here, still loving, still loving." When her children called, she lingered on the phone, not rushing to end the conversation. When her husband reached for her hand in the quiet hours of the evening, she held on a little longer. She didn't stop grieving. She didn't stop missing her father. But the sharp edges softened. One day, standing in her garden, Anne noticed a rose beginning to wilt. She reached down, cradling the fragile bloom in her palm. Instead of sadness, she felt a wave of gratitude. This flower, like her father, like herself, was part of the great turning of life. Birth, bloom, fade, return. That night, Anne wrote in her journal, "I am learning to love what will not last. And in doing so, I am finally fully alive." Buddhist wisdom, Anne realized, wasn't about escaping loss. It was about learning to sit with it, to breathe with it, to allow it to soften the heart instead of harden it. She still feared death sometimes, but now, when the fear rose, she sat with it, hand on her chest, whispering, "This too belongs." And in those moments, a quiet peace stirred inside her. The kind of peace that comes not from answers, but from presence. It began with a rose. Anne had always loved her garden, but it wasn't until after her father died that she really saw it. Before, the roses were just part of the background. A splash of color in the blur of errands, work, appointments. But now, they became something else. Each morning, she found herself drawn outside, still in her robe, cradling a mug of coffee between her hands. She would walk barefoot across the grass, cool and wet with dew, and stand in front of the rose bushes. She touched the petals gently, felt their softness, their slight give beneath her fingertips. One morning, a petal fell as she brushed it, drifting soundlessly to the ground. Anne bent to pick it up. It was the palest shade of pink, edged with brown. Fragile, fleeting. She held it between her fingers, marveling at how something so delicate could carry so much meaning. That was the moment the rose became her teacher. In Buddhism, symbols are not ornaments. They are doorways, doorways into truth, into seeing what is real. For Anne, the rose became the doorway into impermanence. She began to notice it everywhere. In the way the sunlight shifted across the walls of her bedroom, painting gold in the morning and fading to soft gray by evening. In the way her children's voices, once sharp and eager, came now through the phone line, shaped by adult worries, softened by distance. In the way her own face greeted her in the mirror, not as the young woman she once was, but as the woman she had become, with the quiet grace and gravity of 51 years. Everywhere, the world was whispering, "Nothing stays. Everything changes." And that is not a tragedy. That is life. Anne shared this with May, the Buddhist teacher, one evening after meditation. They were drinking tea in the dim light of the center's small library, surrounded by books worn soft with use. Anne told her about the roses, about the falling petals, about the ache and the tenderness that came in equal measure. May smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "In Japan," she said softly, "there's a practice called hanami, flower viewing. People gather beneath the cherry blossoms not just to admire their beauty, but to celebrate their impermanence. The blossoms fall, and in their falling they remind us how precious each moment is." Anne let those words settle into her bones. She realized then that her grief had been asking the wrong question. It wasn't, "How do I stop this pain?" It was, "How do I carry this love in a world where nothing lasts?" The rose became her companion. When she missed her father, she would walk into the garden and sit quietly. When she felt the sharp pinch of loneliness, She would hold a fallen petal in her palm and breathe with it. When her children came home to visit, she would point out the roses to them as if to say, "Look, this moment. Hold it close." She began to see the people around her differently. The hurried cashier at the grocery store, the neighbor struggling to carry groceries, the co-worker sighing heavily at her desk, and saw them all as passing roses, beautiful, brief, tender. She smiled more. She softened. One day, while cleaning out a drawer, Anne found a small wooden box her father had given her as a child. Inside was a silver ring, plain and unadorned, slightly tarnished with age. She slipped it onto her finger. It didn't fit as it once had, but it carried the weight of memory, the warmth of all the years she'd held him close. It became another symbol, another reminder. What we carry is not the body. It is the presence, the love. And that does not fade with time. Buddhist wisdom teaches that symbols are not meant to be clung to. They are meant to awaken the heart. Anne understood this on a morning in late autumn. She stepped outside and saw that the roses had withered in the cold. Their leaves were crisped, their petals scattered across the ground like soft confetti. Her first instinct was sadness, a tight squeeze in her chest, but then she knelt, gathered a few petals in her hands, and whispered, "Thank you, not just to the flowers, to the season, to her father, to herself, for loving, for losing, for surviving, for continuing." In the weeks that followed, Anne carried the symbol of the rose with her everywhere. When a friend called in tears over her own aging parents, Anne listened deeply, not rushing to fix or offer solutions. When her husband fretted about retirement plans, she laid a hand gently over his and reminded him, "We are here now." When she visited her mother, frail and fading, she sat beside her, not filling the silence with chatter, but simply being there, hand resting on hand, heart open and present, and began to understand what Mai had meant when she said, "Impermanence is not the end of love. It is the invitation to love more deeply." On the day her mother passed, Anne sat at her bedside, holding the old silver ring in one hand and a single rose in the other. There were no grand speeches, no final words meant to tie everything together, just breath and presence and the quiet heartbeat of a life shared. And as the last breath came and went, Anne felt something she had not expected. Not peace exactly, not relief, but a profound, wordless knowing. This too belongs. This too is love. In the months that followed, Anne kept a single vase on her kitchen table, always holding one flower, never a full bouquet. It became her daily practice, her small ritual of remembrance. Each time she replaced the flower, she whispered, "Thank you for this day," not in fear, not in desperation, but in deep, quiet gratitude, because Buddhist wisdom had taught her what the rose had always known. Life is precious not because it lasts forever, but because it does not. It happened on a winter night, cold enough that the windows in Anne's bedroom wore a lace of frost by dawn. The house was still, wrapped in the hush that comes when snow blankets the world outside. Anne lay awake, watching the slow spin of moonlight across the ceiling. Her husband's soft breathing filled the room. The clock ticked quietly, a patient reminder of the hours slipping by. And suddenly, without warning, it hit her. A wave of fear, sharp and breathless, rising from somewhere deep in her chest. Anne had known grief. She had sat with loss. But this was something different. This was raw, unfiltered terror. The realization that one day, not in theory but in reality, she too would leave this life. That her heart would stop, that her breath would vanish into stillness, that all she knew, all she loved, would fall away. She sat up in bed, her skin cold, her mouth dry. What happens when it's me? What happens when I close my eyes for the last time? Where will I go? Will I know? Will I know? Her hands shook as she reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. The house felt too quiet, the darkness too deep. Anne was 51 years old, healthy, surrounded by love. And yet, in that moment, she was a child again, staring into the vast unknown. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her husband, and walked to the window. Outside, the world was silver and still, the snow glowing beneath the moon. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, her breath fogging a soft circle. For the first time, she whispered the truth aloud. "I'm afraid to die." And as soon as she said it, something inside her softened. The next morning, Anne went to see May. The Buddhist center was quiet, the meditation room warm with the scent of cedar and candle wax. May sat cross-legged on a cushion, eyes closed, hands resting lightly in her lap. Anne lowered herself onto the cushion beside her, unsure of how to begin. For a while they sat in silence. Then Anne spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was making peace with death. I thought I understood impermanence, but last night it hit me. The fear, the sheer animal fear, and I don't know what to do with it." May opened her eyes slowly, turning to Anne with a gaze that was both soft and piercing. "There is a story," May said, "of a monk who asked the Buddha, 'Master, how can I overcome the fear of death?' And the Buddha replied, 'First learn to die while you are still living.'" Anne furrowed her brow. "I don't understand." May smiled gently. "To die before you die means to practice letting go now while you still have time. To let go of the false self, the one that claims, resists, demands permanence. To make peace with change, with loss, with endings. Not once at the moment of death, but every day, in 1,000 small ways." Anne, I don't know how. I reached over, placed a hand lightly over Anne's and whispered, "Begin with this moment. Breathe. Feel the fear. Hold it like you would hold a frightened child. Do not push it away. Do not shame it. Stay. Stay." That evening Anne sat alone in her garden, wrapped in a thick coat, the cold air sharp against her skin. She closed her eyes, let the fear rise. It came like a wave. The image of her own hands stilled, her voice gone quiet, her body left behind. It came with a tightening in her chest, a rushing in her ears. But this time, she didn't run. She placed a hand over her heart, just as May had taught her. She whispered, "I see you, fear. I will not abandon you. We will sit here together." And slowly the wave began to ebb. Not because the fear was gone, but because Anne was no longer fighting it. She was breathing with it, staying with it. And in that staying, something shifted. In the days that followed, Anne began practicing small acts of letting go. She cleaned out the closet where her father's clothes still hung, folding each shirt with care, whispering thank you as she placed them in a donation box. She let herself cry when old memories rose, no longer holding her grief at arm's length. She began to tell the people she loved what she had kept in her heart. I love you, I'm sorry, thank you, I forgive you. She started noticing the tiny deaths within each day. The setting sun, the end of a conversation, the last page of a book, and instead of rushing past them, she paused, whispered goodbye, and let herself feel the ache. And as she did, Anne discovered something extraordinary. The more she let go, the more alive she felt. The more she allowed herself to die to the moment, the more precious the moment became. She realized that peace was not the absence of fear. Peace was the willingness to stand in the heart of fear, unarmed, unresisting, awake. One afternoon, as she sat with May after meditation, Anne asked, "Do you still fear death?" May smiled, her eyes shining. "But now I see it as part of the dance, a bow at the end of the song. And because I know the bow is coming, I dance more freely. I love more fiercely. I let go more gently." Anne felt tears prick her eye. That night she stood again at her window, watching the moon rise. She placed a rose on the windowsill, a quiet offering, and she whispered, "When the time comes, I will bow too." In the weeks ahead, Anne kept living, not perfectly, not fearlessly, but fully. She laughed more. She cried when she needed to. She reached for her husband's hand more often. She paused to watch the snow fall, the rain bead on the window, the light shift across the walls. She still woke in the night sometimes, heart pounding with the old familiar fear. But now, instead of running, she placed her hand over her heart, breathed deeply, and whispered, "I am here. I am alive, and that is enough." It was a Tuesday morning when Anne first understood that letting go wasn't something you did once. It was something you practiced over and over, like breath, like walking, like loving. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the wood, a cup of tea cooling beside her. On her phone was a voicemail from her daughter, Emily, who had just taken a job in another city. Anne had known this was coming, had even encouraged it. But as she listened to Emily's excited voice, a familiar tightness rose in her chest. Letting go. Again, Anne set the phone down, cradled her tea, and closed her eyes. She breathed into the ache, the longing, the bittersweet pride. And there in the quiet she remembered May's words from the night before at the meditation group. The practice of letting go is not about giving up what you love. It's about holding it with open hands. Anne's days became a series of small releases. In the garden, she knelt to prune the last withered roses of winter, whispering thank you to each stem, each fallen petal. In the kitchen, she cooked dinner for 2 instead of 4, and when the silence at the table pressed too hard against her chest, she lit a candle and called it her companion. At work, when deadlines piled up and her coworkers rushed, Anne slowed. She smiled when she could. She offered help when it was needed, and when it was time to leave, she left, not carrying the office home on her shoulders. She let go again and again in the small spaces of her day. One afternoon, Anne went to visit her mother's grave for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery was quiet, the air sharp with the scent of pine. Anne stood before the headstone, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets, her breath a pale cloud in the cold. For a long time she said nothing. Then softly, she began to speak. "Mom, I miss you." The words trembled, unexpected, raw. I thought I was strong. I thought I was ready, but I wasn't. And maybe I never will be. Her voice broke. And still she stayed. She let the ache rise, let the tears come, let her knees sink to the frozen earth. And then, after a long, long while, she whispered the words she had been holding back for months. "Thank you for everything, for loving me go, for teaching me how to stand here now in this space with all this love and all this loss and keep breathing." Anne rose slowly, brushed the damp from her knees, and placed a single rose at the grave. Not as a goodbye, but as a blessing, a gesture of release. Buddhist teachings call this dana, the practice of generosity, of offering. But May had once told Anne something even deeper. True generosity, Mai said, is not what we give away. It's what we allow to leave. Anne carried this with her in the weeks that followed. She cleaned out her closet, donating the dresses she hadn't worn in years, the ones tied to old versions of herself she no longer needed to carry. She mailed a long handwritten letter to her sister, apologizing for a fight I'd never truly healed from. She took her wedding ring to be resized after years of letting it slip uncomfortably on her finger, finally acknowledging that her body had changed, and that was okay. She practiced letting go not as an event, but as a rhythm. Exhale, release, open, receive. One evening, as the snow fell gently outside, Anne sat with Mai in the meditation hall. "Anne," Mai said quietly, "what is the hardest thing for you to release?" Anne's eyes filled with tears. "My fear of losing, of failing, of not being enough." May nodded, her gaze kind. "And what would happen," she asked softly, "if you let go of even that?" Anne closed her eyes. In the stillness she felt it, the fear curling in her chest, the tight fists around her heart. She breathed in, whispering silently. "I see you," she breathed out, whispering, "You can go." It was not dramatic, no fireworks, no sudden enlightenment, just a softening, a loosening, a small, trembling shift toward freedom. As spring approached, Anne found herself in the garden again, watching the first green shoots push through the dark earth. She crouched down, touched the tender stems, and smiled. It struck her then that letting go was not an ending, it was an opening. A clearing of space for something new to arrive, not to replace what had been lost, but to stand beside it, to weave joy into sorrow, birth into death, beginning into ending. She thought of Emily in her new city, of her father's old ring on her finger, of her mother's grave under the thawing ground. She thought of the people she still loved, the people she had released, the people yet to come. And in that quiet, sunlit moment, Anne whispered to the earth, to herself, to the life still unfolding around her, "Thank you for letting me let go." That night, Anne wrote in her journal, "I used to think peace was something I would earn when I had fixed everything, solved everything, healed everything. Now I understand peace is something I practice each day, each hour." not by holding on, but by letting go, by surrendering to the beauty and the ache of this one brief, precious life. It was a small moment that changed everything. Anne was walking through the park on a Sunday afternoon, the first real warmth of spring softening the air. Families gathered on picnic blankets. Children raced across the grass, their laughter lifting toward the sky. A young couple sat beneath a tree, heads bent together, lost in quiet conversation. Anne sat on a bench beneath a wide old oak, her coat draped loosely over her lap. For years she would have sat here restless, fingers twitching to check her phone, mind drifting to errands or obligations. But now, something was different. Anne sat still. She watched, she breathed, and in that small, ordinary moment, she felt it, a stillness in her chest, a quiet opening, as if something heavy she had carried her whole life had finally been set down. For the first time, Anne understood, not just in her head but in her bones, what May had meant when she spoke of freedom. Buddhist wisdom teaches that true peace is not found by escaping the reality of death, but by walking straight into its presence with an open heart. Anne had spent years fearing death as an end, a cliff, a sudden vanishing. But here, beneath the oak, she saw it differently. She watched a petal fall from a tree, spinning softly to the ground. She watched an elderly man lift his wife's walker into the trunk of their car, his hands steady, practiced with love. She watched a little girl pause in the middle of a game, turning to wave at her mother on a bench. Each moment was full and fleeting. Each moment carried its own small death. The end of a laugh, the fading of sunlight, the letting go of a hand. And yet, in all of it, there was no tragedy, only life, moving, shifting, reshaping itself. Anne felt something loosen inside her. A knot she hadn't known she was carrying began to untangle. That evening, Anne returned home, took off her coat, and sat at the kitchen table. She reached for her journal, the one she had filled over months with thoughts, questions, memories. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Today I saw the world as it is, not as I want it to be, not as I want it to be, not as I fear it will become. And for a moment I understood. Peace is not the absence of death. Peace is the presence of life, held lightly, loved deeply, released freely." In the days that followed, Anne's life did not become perfect. The bills still arrived in the mail. The news still brought sorrow. Her knees still ached in the mornings. But something had shifted. When her daughter called, anxious about work, Anne listened with an open heart, not rushing to fix, but simply being present. When her husband reached for her hand during a quiet walk, Anne held it as if it were the first and last time. When a friend canceled plans, Anne smiled, understanding that change was life's language. She had stopped clinging. She had stopped gripping the world with tight, fearful fists. Instead, she lived with open hands. One afternoon, Anne returned to the Buddhist center, sitting beside Mai in the meditation hall. "I feel lighter," Anne whispered. Mai smiled. "It's not because the world has changed," she said softly. "It's because you have." Anne nodded. "I thought I had to master death," she said quietly. "I thought I had to conquer the fear. But now I see. I just had to make room for it, to let it sit beside me like an old friend." Mai placed a hand over Anne's, And when you do that, she whispered, you become free. That night, Anne walked through her garden, the early blooms trembling in the breeze. She paused at the rosebush, fingers brushing the new buds. For the first time, she did not dread the moment the petals would fall. She knew they would fall, and she loved them more for it. In the weeks that followed, Anne carried this new peace with her, not as armor, but as a soft light. She smiled more easily at strangers. She forgave small irritations. She took long walks alone, not to escape, but to arrive. One morning, Anne looked at herself in the mirror, studying the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the silver threading through her hair. She smiled. These were not signs of loss. These were the markings of a life fully lived. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the heart opens most fully, not when it is armored against death, but when it is softened by love. Anne understood now that the more she let herself feel the ache of impermanence, the more she came alive. She laughed with a fuller voice. She held her loved ones with gentler hands. She met each day as if it were a guest at her door, welcomed, honored, and then, when it was time, released with gratitude. One evening, sitting beneath the oak in the park, Anne watched the sun slip below the horizon. She closed her eyes and placed a hand over her heart. I am here. I am alive. I am alive. I am ready to let go when the time comes. And until then, I will live. Anne sat alone in the garden that evening, wrapped in a shawl, a cup of tea cradled between her palms. The air was cool, the sky painted with the soft blush of twilight. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its last song of the day. And in that moment, Anne felt it again. The quiet peace she had once thought impossible. Not the peace of having everything figured out. Not the peace of having escaped fear or grief or change. But the peace that comes when you stop running. When you stop fighting the truth of life. When you turn and face it with open eyes, with an open heart, and whisper, I am here. And this is enough. She had learned so much over the past year. She had learned that the ache of loss is not a flaw in love, but its echo. She had learned that grief is not something to fix, but something to tend, like a garden after the frost. She had learned that letting go is not about pushing life away, but about meeting it fully and releasing it gently. And most of all, she had learned this: we do not make peace with death by denying it. We make peace with death by learning to live with it beside us, as a companion, as a teacher, as a quiet reminder to love, to laugh, to forgive, to let the small things go, and to hold the people we love just a little closer, just a little longer. That night, Anne sat beneath the old oak tree in the park, the same place where her journey into peace had truly begun. She watched the moon rise, pale and luminous. She felt the earth cool beneath her feet. She listened to the hush of the world settling into night. And then, softly, she whispered to the sky, thank you. Not to anyone in particular, not to anything she could name, but to life itself. Thank you for the love. Thank you for the ache. Thank you for the lessons. Thank you for the chance to practice, to stumble, to rise, to soften. Thank you for the quiet miracle of this day, this breath, this moment. To you, listening now, Anne's story is not just Anne's. It is ours. It is yours. You too carry grief. You too carry fear. You too wonder what it will mean to one day say goodbye. And here's what Buddhist wisdom, what the lotus flower, what the journey itself offers you. You do not have to wait for a perfect moment to make peace. You do not have to wait to conquer your fear, to fix your life, to understand all the mysteries. You can begin now, with a breath, with a whisper, with a soft turning toward the life that is already here, already waiting for you to notice. So I invite you now, wherever you are, to close your eyes for a moment, to place a hand over your heart, to feel the gentle rise and fall of your breath, and to say softly, just for yourself, I am here, I am alive, and today I choose to live with open hands, open eyes, open heart. I will love, I will grieve, I will forgive, I will forgive, I will let go. And when the time comes, I will bow, and I will say thank you. At Lotus Light Teachings, we walk this path together. We walk with the wisdom of the Buddha, with the soft light of mindfulness, with the quiet strength of surrender, with the tender, fierce love that knows how to stay and how to release. So if this story has touched your heart, if you have felt even a small softening inside you, I invite you to join us. Subscribe. Walk this path with us. Breathe with us. Let's keep learning how to meet life, how to meet death, how to meet ourselves with gentle courage, with humble wonder, with a heart that knows. This is enough. This is everything. And as Anne sat beneath the moon, a rose blooming softly beside her, she understood at last. She was not waiting for life to begin. She was not waiting for death to end. She was simply here, a small light in the vast sky, grateful for one more breath, grateful for one more moment, grateful to have loved and to have let go. As you sit quietly now, perhaps with the memory of Anne's story still lingering in your heart, I invite you to pause and feel. Feel your breath. Feel the soft pulse of life moving through you. Feel the simple, undeniable truth that you are here now. We cannot escape the truth of impermanence. We cannot hold back the tide of change. But we can meet it with grace. We can meet it with love. We can meet it with love. So tonight, as you prepare to sleep, or tomorrow as you wake, may you remember that peace is not something you will find at the end of your life. It is something you can begin to practice today. Here, now, in this breath, by forgiving, by letting go, by saying thank you, by choosing presence over fear. And if this message has touched your heart, if you long to walk this path of mindful living, of Buddhist wisdom, of quiet healing, I warmly invite you to subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings. Here, you will find a home for your heart. Here, you will walk with others who are learning, like you, how to rest in the great mystery, how to face the ache of life and the beauty of death, and how to live, not perfectly, but fully, tenderly awake. Thank you for walking this path with us. Until next time, may you rest gently inside your own heart.